So we're starting a new set of eras today: Orientalism, Romanticism, and the Enlightenment. We'll start with the Enlightenment, then move to Orientalism, and then Romanticism. During the Enlightenment, we see that art is based on some new philosophies. It's based on philosophies about education. It's based on philosophies of where women's position in the patriarchal society was. It's based on logic and reasoning, and the idea that jobs should go to people who are qualified by skill sets to have them, but not by the divine right to rule. Women in society have very few options. They tend to marry for business purposes so that they can secure a title or they can secure wealth. And men do the same. They may be titled but not have wealth, and the woman has a large dowry, or sometimes that role reversal is flipped where the woman is titled but doesn't have a large dowry, and the man comes with her financial security. And so financial security becomes a real problem for women in the late 1750s to 1800s because there aren't jobs that they can get unless they want to be a governess and work for another household. That means that they basically give their life up to educate a child. Um, they additionally there weren't as many opportunities. And so, if women found themselves trying to support themselves on their own, they really didn't have a lot of options other than working in the sex trade or possibly, like I said, educating a child or working in a household as a maid. Um, Ideas about education become ideas that are based on logic and reasoning. And the modern university is really born from this idea of humanism and the Enlightenment. The stylistic hallmarks that we see in Enlightenment art are themes of education for both men and women, domestic genre scenes, high attention to texture, and portraiture that negates the divine right to rule. Portraiture in the Enlightenment takes form of paintings of lords and ladies of the estates, but there's always an element of education in them, and they don't feature large expanses of land that prove their wealth. They are more focused on education or some skill set in that the sitter has. Two of the main artists that we see during this time period are Chardin and Copley. Okay, so let's discuss the people that were involved in the Enlightenment. So the Rococo ends, and the Enlightenment really is the opposite of the Rococo. The Rococo is all about excessiveness and frilliness and the sort of exasperation of wealth of the bourgeoisie and the elite in society. And so we have some new people that come along that sort of band together and challenge the ideas of the aristocracy, empowering the middle class to revolt. Diderot was one of those people. He wrote a 35-volume set of encyclopedias that explains the ideas of the Enlightenment. He reviews the work of the French Salon and we label him as the very first art critic. Now, there was an art historian back in the Renaissance time called Vasari, and we look to his theories for sort of the documentation of history. But as far as art criticism, Diderot was the very first. He believed that art should inspire virtue and manners. Sir Isaac Newton was another instrumental figure in the Enlightenment. He was an Englishman, and he wrote about scientific discovery with John Locke. Their discoveries denounced the metaphysical world. So all those ideas of ghosts and spirits and witches and religion are all denounced by them. And they feel that all that one can believe in is something that is rationalized through explanation of reason and empirical proof. So tangible data and experience. This promotes a rationalized society. John Locke was a philosopher, and he transforms Newton's scientific theories into socio-political concepts. Those concepts rally around cornerstone ideas that people are good and not born of original sin, that they have the right to life, liberty, and property, as well as the right to conscious thought, and that the government's role is to protect those rights. They believe that the government that fails to protect these rights should be revolted against by its citizens, that people should take control of their own destiny. And last but not least, we talk about Voltaire. Your book claims that Voltaire was the embodiment of the spirit of the Enlightenment. He really loathed the divine right to rule and how the divine right to rule was connected to religious belief. His ideas paved the way for revolution in France and brings together like-minded scholarship that eventually causes revolution. Sir Isaac Newton and John Locke were cornerstones in Europe, in England, and Diderot was one of the cornerstone ideal minds in the New Americas. And so these cornerstone ideas branch out in Europe to giant amount of revolution. They kind of get the revolution ball rolling, and you'll see it just keeps going into the world wars that we see in Europe and the United States. So let's look at some art. Chardin was an artist that highly admired Diderot. And he followed the tradition of the Dutch genre painters. He painted intimate scenes of daily life from the middle class or bourgeoisie life. We also call the bourgeoisie the landed gentry. He was the first painter to feel that the work and lives of women and children were a worthy subject to paint about. So before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about the bourgeoisie and social class structure. The bourgeoisie were the group of people that were the upper middle class. They were the people that served the aristocracy. They were the lords of the land. They were the people who were the upper middle class. They owned most of the land, and the middle class were business owners that leased the lands from the lords. They were the working class. The landed gentry were this new group of people in which wealth came from the land. They were a group of people that were being gifted land by the bourgeoisie class. So how did that happen? Well, it comes from the old feudal system and carried over into the 1800s. So in the 1800s, you have all these people that used to be titled lords and ladies of the land, and because of that, they own large properties. Those properties are being gifted to their children and the next generations, and we call those people the bourgeoisie or the landed gentry. A lot of people just simply inherited their wealth. And then you have a group of working middle class people, and that group is growing. It's becoming more powerful. And with the ideas of the Enlightenment, it becomes a force to be reckoned with all over Europe and in the United States, which eventually leads to revolution. Okay, so now that you understand a little bit more about social class, you understand what Chardin's ideas were, let's look at Chardin's art. This is the governess. You can see the genre scene. The painting is of the governess who is speaking to a child that she governs. And he holds a book in his arm, tucked underneath his arm. He's wearing finer clothing, and she's brushing his hat. She's discussing something with him. And we are led to believe that the discussion has something to do with him leaving his childhood past behind him, growing up and becoming educated, and she's going to teach him the ways of the world so that he can be released into society and take his rightful place in society with his privilege of being gifted part of the landed gentry. So the toys on the floors represent his childhood that he's getting ready to leave behind. She brushes his hat. A lot of times back then, that's how they cleaned clothing. They simply brushed it off, especially if it was something that was worn a lot outside. The idea of modern day washing is something of a new post-industrial revolution concept. And so she's brushing his hat. She probably brushed his coat, and he's discussing with her activities of the day. She leans forward to indicate that her relationship with the boy is somewhat intimate, but it's not too intimate. She's his parent. Or not too intimate because she's not his parent. Chardin paints this scene with great detail to texture. You can see the textures in the clothing. You can see the textures in the sewing box, in the walls, and in the carpet. And so you see that evidence of him following the Dutch style of genre portraiture, or the Dutch style of genre scenes, as well as that Dutch attention to texture. The thing that Chardin doesn't do quite the same as, say, Vermeer is he's not all about the light. There is a light source in the room. It's coming from the door, but it's a soft light. It provides some sense of chiaroscuro, the turning of the body in the light. This is Chardin saying grace. And the one thing I want to be sure that I convey to you is the overall meaning of these paintings that were of the Enlightenment was really to establish that the people that lived enlightened lives were content. They were happy in their lines of duty. They were happy in their daily life of what they did. Diderot wrote about Chardin, and I thought that I would read to you what he wrote. About saying grace. There are many small pictures by Chardin at the Salon. Almost all of them depict fruit with the accoutrements for a meal. This is nature itself. The objects stand out from the canvas, and they are so real that my eyes are fooled by them. In order to look at other people's paintings, I feel as though I need different eyes. But to look at Chardin's, I need only to keep the ones nature gave. Let's back up. In order to look at other people's paintings, I feel as though I need different eyes. But to look at Chardin's, I need only to keep the ones nature gave me and use them properly. If I had painting in mind as a career for my child, I'd buy this one and have him copy it. Yet nature itself may be no more difficult to copy. Oh, Chardin, it's not white, red, or black pigment that you grind on your palette, but rather the very substance of objects. It's real air and light that you take onto the tip of your brush and transfer onto the canvas. It's magic. One can't understand how it's done. Thick layers of color applied one on top of each other, each one filtering through the underneath to create the effect. Close up, everything blurs, glows flat, and disappears. From a distance, everything comes back to life and reappears. And so Diderot is telling you that the close-up image that I have given you seems to blur out the detail, and that as you back up, the detail seems to reappear. How that actually works, I am not 100% positive. I have only seen Chardin's work once or twice. I can tell you that I was not blown away by its minute textures of Van Eyck. However, they have a sense of peacefulness to them. They are not meant to be dramatic. They are not meant to be visually gripping to the viewer. They are not meant for the viewer to stand back and have a jaw-dropping reaction to the painting. They're meant to convey contentment. They're meant to convey peace and solace through everyday life. Another artist that we see that does Enlightenment portraiture is Copley. This is Thomas Mifflin and Sarah Morris. He paints this in 1773, and this is Life in the Americas. She's holding a piece of paper and a quill, indicating that she can read. There's a sentiment of education in the image. Enlightenment portraiture looks like this. It has a sense of education. It has indication of contentment of the life that the Enlightenment provides. A sense of contentment that the scientific world is proof enough, and that what you can see, what you can touch, what you have evidence of is logical and in front of you and can be believed in. And so these type of portraitures, the portraits of Thomas Mifflin and Sarah Morris, are portraits that usually are done for recording engagement or recording their marriage, and they often don't have a feeling of swept off your feet love. They're more logical. They have more of a sense of what I see is in front of me. So just now that you've got neoclassicism down, we're going to move on to a new theme called orientalism. Orientalism are basically themes that deal with the Middle East. They're themes that deal with Eastern type concepts. They're highly focused on texture, and they have a sense of sultriness to them. So let's talk about why Orientalism became so popular. It became popular with the aristocracy. They start to replace the Rococo style with it. Obviously, they're still not fully behind neoclassicism because it's the idea that they have to let go of their hedonistic ways and turn to the state of France. But this style is very much something that the French Royal Academy accepts and that the aristocracy enjoys. But it doesn't really last for long. It's a short-lived period of time. But you'll notice that the themes in this particular art historical era have an interesting thing going on. So let's look at those. So this is Ingres' Grand Odalisque. And one of the things that you need to know about this particular piece is that it has a wonky representation. If you start to really look at the way her body is shaped, you'll notice that the leg that rests on top doesn't really connect into her body quite right. Additionally, as you look further closer, you see that her spine is really elongated and that her hips and buttocks area are very large. Additionally, the breast that is in the upper right hand side where her shoulder meets her torso is really in an odd place. Breasts usually rest a little bit lower on the torso. Her feet seem a little small for her body to me, and her head is nowhere near proportional to the amount of space that her torso takes up. You can see that there's this high focus on textures here. You can see that the silk drapery behind her, that's the bright chromatic blue, looks like silk or taffeta. The pillow that she lays on has a velvet type texture to it. You can see that she's laying on top of a piece of fur. Her fan has feathers, and you can see, and I've seen this painting up close, you see every single feather point in the fan. It's really quite beautiful. Also, you see that there's a jeweled medallion that would have been part of her robe. That's very detailed in representation as well. She's quite beautiful. She's basically the white man's fantasy of a harem. She is European looking, but she takes on an Eastern theme with the hookah pipe and the head wrap that is geometric in shape. This is another one of those Orientalism paintings. The one thing that I would say about this painting, it touches on the idea that France really is in denial of the way its culture is. Prostitution and female slavery go on in France quite prevalently at this time. But you can see that they don't want to take, or they don't want to claim the idea that prostitution goes on in France. And so they paint it going on in the Middle East. You can see that this young lady is being sold as a slave, and the market director is checking her teeth to make sure that all her teeth are there, and they've declothed her to show the merchandise to the people who would be purchasing her. You can see that the man behind her is wearing a long robe, and the man behind the guy in the green is wearing a head wrap as well as a long robe. They definitely are depicting this as something that goes on in the East and not something that goes on in France. It's kind of like that goes on over there. And unfortunately, they just don't want to take responsibility for the fact that it goes on in France too. If this were a different scene that were painted in France and it had French markers to it to say that this painting's background was French, then it would not be popular in France at all and they would have rejected it. So before we move on to Romanticism, I want to talk about Orientalism. Orientalism is a subset of Romanticism, in that it shows an ideal set of something that isn't necessarily, or that isn't true. Orientalism is a romanticized and inaccurate view of the East, especially North Africa and the Middle East. Cultural stereotypes are depicted and further perpetuated by this type of painting. Western society essentializes Asian, North African, and Middle Eastern societies with the idea that Western society is developed and Eastern society is less than. This style is a result of Napoleon looting Egypt in 1798. He opens the Louvre in 1804, and in 1798, when he invades Egypt, he takes back thousands of Egyptian objects to the Louvre to display. After he returns to Paris, he commissions a 24-volume book called The Description of Egypt that projected a Western account of the Egyptian people, lands, and its culture. From that, this style of Orientalism develops, and the Western viewpoint of Middle Eastern and North African areas comes to fruition. Hollywood then continues to exploit West African and Indian and Middle Eastern and Asian cultures to create a set of romanticized hallmarks that we as Westerners have grown accustomed to seeing and associate with those cultures. And so this is why I say that Western society essentializes. Essentializes means that they set Western society up as being superior to an inferior group of people. That sense of superiority and inferiority comes from is a result of colonization. There's still a big market for this genre in the French art world until the end of the century, so way into the 1900s. Artists like Gérôme cater to the more sexual fantasies of their fellow Europeans. The Europeans purchase these paintings and they adopt these stereotypes. Orientalism is the colonized gaze upon the colonized Orient, because most of the Westerners have not actually been to the Orient and have bought paintings and images of subject matter that is ill-informed. The colonized sell a viewpoint that North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia are primitive and exotic, which are both terms that in the art historical world mean a sense of inferiority versus a sense of subordination. So I get very offended when people start talking about how primitive certain art is, and you will see that as we move further into modern art. Primitive has a negative connotation. It associates a sense of uneducatedness with the art. And exotic seems to evoke a sense of something that Westerners are allowed to be voyeuristic about, which just seems very wrong. Artists like Gérôme paint images like this nude boy standing in front of a large crowd of men. Some say the nudity of the boy means that the viewer thinks of their own nudity, but I feel that it shows the child as being vulnerable, insinuating a negative connotation about the men who are watching the boy. Regardless of what we think the boy represents, we see that Gérôme renders the texture of the walls, floor, and clothing with great detail, adding to the feeling that the scene is an event that actually took place. And so, as a Westerner, if you're purchasing this type of art and you've never been to the Orient, and Jerome has painted these minute details of the Quranic text on the back of the walls, of the mosaic ceramic tiles on the back wall, it feels as if Jerome was actually there. There's a sense of realism that captures it and makes the viewer feel as if Jerome witnessed this. When in all actuality, Jerome never witnessed this. He was just making large commissions off of the images because there was a market for it. Well, I would say one of the most famous of the Orientalist painters was Eugene Delacroix. Delacroix paints the death of Sardanapalus, and we see an exotic theme, a sense of erotic treatment of the figures. Sardanapalus was getting ready to be invaded. His country was getting ready to be invaded. And so he's partying his last party because he knows he's ready to be captured and killed. And so you see concubines in his quarters, men having their way with the concubines. Delacroix romanticizes this scene with very rich color, a sense of dramatic emotionalism. The scene itself, the image itself, is one that evokes an emotional reaction because we see the women in the painting. It also just seems their gestures, the gestures of the men, seem very dramatic. Some scholars claim that Delacroix has painted the grandest romantic drama ever painted in this painting. The painting was inspired by Lord Byron's poem, Sardanapalus. It was a poem that described the last days of a king from ancient Assyria. The painting is not a complete illustration of the poem's text, but it depicts the last hour that the ancient Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, will soon be run over by conquerors. So just like I said, the country's getting invaded and he's going to be taken out. And so he is spending his last hour in this manner. So I ask you, does he look like he's getting ready to be conquered? Is he looking like he's about to be killed by some strange invasion? Or does that idea that there's some strange invasion getting ready to come for this king leave you with an eerie feeling? The fabrics are rendered with great detail. They are rendered with great rich textures. In the poem, the Assyrian king sacrifices his courtiers and himself before he can be captured. And we see this beautiful, rich, vibrant red that pulls the eye in and makes us focus directly on the king. In addition to, he utilizes that X-composition that Titian so famously made popular, as well as you can see that Delacroix was influenced, or that Rubens has made his mark on Delacroix's art. So modern day Orientalism looks like this. We've seen many more Orientalist type depictions. Aladdin is just one example of that. But we know that these type of representations of culture are ones that are jaded by the original movement of Orientalism. Okay, so we looked at sort of that pre Orientalist phase of Orientalism, or I'm sorry, pre Romanticism phase of Orientalism. Now we're going to move on to Romanticism. So, Romanticism has some stylistic features that I have written down here for you. Subject matter often depicts the horrific. It often is meant to evoke an extreme emotional response. Artists go to extreme measures to feel the events that they are depicting, so that their painting reflects the feeling that they are depicting. They can be spiritual. They have a sense of unrestrained emotion. Landscapes take on the shape of the countryside as being perfect. We see landscapes in which nature is completely uncontrolled. Medieval and exotic tales. And there's a painterly style, and impasto becomes an important technique used. We have a new emphasis on the sublime. What is the sublime? The sublime is the idea that there's something out there that is greater than oneself. So a little bit of background information of what fuels Romanticism. What fuels Romanticism? 100% the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Many artists feel that the Industrial Revolution is threatening the beauty in the world. They also feel that the Enlightenment has robbed the art world of a sense of emotionalism. The Romanticists reject neoclassicism. They have a desire for freedom. They want imagination over reason. And literary movements are also majorly influential in this time period. So this slide confused some of you last week because on it is listed that exotic themes are included in the Romanticist period. This is true. We do see exotic themes, but they are not the same as the exotic themes that are being discussed in Orientalism. And Orientalism has a focus on Middle Eastern ideas and culture, whereas the exotic themes that we're talking about in Romanticism tend to be themes of the occult, of monsters, of evil things. This painting is called The Death of General Wolfe, and it's by Benjamin West. Benjamin West was an English painter, and he painted in the late 1700s. So what we're looking at is an interesting configuration of a death that happened on the battlefield. Obviously, the death of the central figure, who is General Wolfe. The things that make this painting romantic is primarily in the subject matter and the way the artist depicts the subject matter. So you can see that there's a flag that is in the center of the painting, but it veers into a diagonal, so that makes the painting more interesting in the way that it breaks up the composition. You see General Wolfe, he's laying in the center of the painting, dying, and there are people around him lamenting. If you can think all the way back to Giotto's arena chapel. This particular painting is reminiscent of that lamentation scene. So Benjamin West is using knowledge of popular painting techniques that would have been known to him at the time. He is likening General Wolfe to that of Christ by placing the flag behind him and having General Wolfe drooping at the base of the flag as if he'd been taken off the cross just like Jesus. You can see that there is a blue-coated soldier kneeling next to the red-coated soldier, and the faces of the people right around General Wolfe are pretty dramatic, as well as General Wolfe's face is dramatic too. The people that are huddled around General Wolfe while he's dying are people who naturally wouldn't have been there together all at the same time. You have a Native American. There are people of various social classes. So there's obviously the red-coated General Wolfe and the blue-coated soldier from the United States. And then, of course, you have a group of red coats and some naturally dressed people. And so the other thing is that likely when General Wolfe died, he would have died in battle on the battlefield just like everybody else. And there would not have been this crowd standing around him. So this is why we call this painting early romanticism. It doesn't quite yet hit all those romantic points, but it's starting to edge on the idea of romantic painting, that things are depicted in a way that seem very believable, but when you first start looking at them, but then when you get closer to looking at the subject matter, it seems a little unbelievable. You can also see the sky in the painting. On the right side, it's all dark and cloudy, and on the left, the heavens are painted bright and glorious, as if they're opening to accept General Wolfe. And the light shines from the heavens down onto his body. You can see that he's actually the brightest thing in the painting. This painting is actually quite large in real life. And so that makes a difference in terms of how we view the painting. Here you're looking at it as a small slide, but in life it's really a larger painting. This is history painting as well as romanticism. And Benjamin West was actually the founder of the Academy of Arts in Philadelphia. So the Academy of Arts was the first Academy of Arts in the United States, and that was founded in Philadelphia, where the nation's capital would have been at the time. Well, West's painting launches Romanticism as a movement in Britain, and Fuseli is one of the early Romantic artists. He is from Switzerland, but he rises in the ranks of the elite society in London. He takes a trip to Rome in 1770, where he develops his own style that's dramatically inspired by classical playwrights like Shakespeare and Homer. He sees the work of Michelangelo, and instead of going in the direction of the neoclassicists, he develops his own direction. He responds to Michelangelo and Shakespeare's work by depicting the supernatural and irrational. This particular painting tells the story of the incubus. It's a monster that can only be appeased by having intimate contact with young women. There's a horse that serves as a voyeur. The image communicates fear of the unknown and unknowable and unrestrained sexuality. It's exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1782, but was not popular with Fuseli's contemporaries. However, the public loved the painting, and so he continues to work in this style, because it sells. So now we're going to return to Copley, who painted the dramatization of an event in which a 14-year-old boy named Watson was attacked by a shark in the Havana harbor in Cuba. The shark bit off his leg before Watson was rescued. Copley uses his influence from Benjamin West's painting of the death of General Wolfe, and we can see that in the pyramidal composition that he creates with the people. You see Watson in the river, the men that reach out from the boat to rescue Watson, the man that stands tall in the center of the ship, the African man, and the man to his right who is harpooning the shark. That is obviously quite fantastical. Sharks don't typically come that close to the surface or attack people in quite that manner. We see the pyramidal composition adopted from Benjamin West's painting, but also the imagined representation of the shark that took Watson's right leg. The inclusion of the African man could be likened to Benjamin West's Native American man who was in the painting The Death of General Wolfe. But there are some other interpretations of why the African man was included in this work of art. Unfortunately, the event occurs while Watson is serving in a shipping crew for the transatlantic slave trade. He was transporting slaves from West Africa to the West Indies, and he was attacked by a shark. Watson commissioned the painting at the apex of the conflict that America is in about the civility of the slave trade. Because of the inclusion of the African gentleman, it could be interpreted that the painting was Watson's sympathy for the people of West Africa. Or the inclusion of the African man in the painting could indicate that the event took place in Havana. We don't have any record of exactly who the West African man represents or why he is there. I have given you 3 different possible reasons. We just don't know. Copley would display his paintings in popular places around London and charge admission for people to come and see his paintings. So Copley has this interesting bridge of styles. He, on one hand, is depicting a historic event, an event that was recorded by the newspapers. And on another hand, he is presenting an event that is highly dramatized. It is unlikely that there would have been this sort of clean of a representation of people who were wandering the sea, going to reach for Watson and save Watson. The sharks would not have triangulated themselves so quite perfectly. So this isn't just a historical representation, it's also a romanticized representation of a historical event. And because of that, like I said, we can't really be sure of the meaning of the painting. We do know that Copley was originally from Boston, but moved to London. And so he was in the center of the argument about the transatlantic slave triangle and trading company. I didn't talk to you about Goya last week, I don't think. He's a very important artist in Spain because he is the royal painter for the court of Madrid. He does have to share his spotlight or his title with a few other painters at the time, but he does the main work of portraiture for them. He also drafts what they call cartoons, or they were basically drawings or designs for tapestries that would be hung in the court. But what we're going to look of his is his romantic paintings and one of his illustrations from Los Caprichos. So, Los Caprichos, well, we'll talk about that when we get to Los Caprichos, but one of the things that was really interesting about Goya is that he ended up going deaf, and we think that was because he had syphilis. During the time that he goes deaf, he produces some really haunting paintings. We don't know if that had to do with the fact that he was losing his hearing, or if it was more about political unrest that was going on in Spain. Remember, Spain is right next to France, and politically and historically, they end up following in the same turmoil that France has. So this is Goya's Los Caprichos. It is only one of the prints from the series. Los Caprichos was a series of prints. I think there were probably 50 or more. It had 3 sections in the book that was produced, and the first section was a little less focused on the occult. The middle section was more focused on the occult, and the third section was a combination of both the occult and earthly themes. This piece was actually the front runner or the face piece for the book. And you can see it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. It is a political statement about what's going on in Spain at the current time. Like I said, they follow in France's direction. And he's talking about the Enlightenment in here. The man that sits, the central figure, he's dreaming. And he's an Enlightenment believer. And you can see that the monsters are flowing around behind him, and it's somewhat like his dream world is coming to life. This is what they call an aquatint etching. It's done by preparing the plate with something called a ground, which is like a clay, and then you put the aquatint in an acid bath, and it eats away at the ground. And so you can also put grain on the plate, and it will create a texture for you. This painting is one of Goya's most famous paintings. It's called The 3rd of May. And what happened is that he is depicting an event that happened on May 2nd. Napoleon's soldiers come into Spain, and they're getting ready to attack. And this militia of Spanish people who are trying to protect their town go out to one of the roads on the outskirts of town and meet Napoleon's troops. You can see that Napoleon's troops are all armed, but yet we don't see any of their faces. And then you can see that the Spanish troop has one central figure who is standing or kneeling upright with his arms stretched out wide. That is intentional. The figure actually mimics the idea of the crucifix. He is likening the Spanish militia person to Jesus hanging on the cross. You can see that the main light shines off of the central figure, and the church is present in the background, which is definitely intentional. He's the only one that's not fully standing and not completely on the ground. He's kneeling, which also adds to the idea of martyrdom. You can see that the bloodiest depiction is closest to the audience. The figures that are laying down on the ground that have been slain are the ones that we see first because they're closest to the canvas or to the picture frame. Goya intentionally doesn't give the French soldiers faces because he is trying to dehumanize them. Now, is it likely that the Spanish group went out to the outskirts of town to meet these soldiers without any weaponry at all. Probably very unlikely. And so this is really the crux of what Romanticism is all about. It's the idea that the artist is depicting something through rose-colored glasses. He's depicting a scene which is very one-sided. He's romanticizing the Spanish soldier's plight. He's romanticizing the way that the Spanish soldiers met the French soldiers and kept them from going into town. And it's basically that the Spanish soldiers didn't succeed, and so they ended up being martyrs, and the French soldiers marched on into town. Let's look at some romantic paintings so that you can kind of cement that idea further into what Romanticism is. But before we go to looking at another romantic painting, you'll see this beautiful portrait of Charles the family by Goya. He was the court painter for Charles IV, and so he really paints people as he sees them. He paints them as individuals. Each has their own type of attire, but yet the women are all dressed similarly. It's just basically a record of Charles's family. It's not really a romantic painting. It's not really glamour painting. It's just portraiture. This painting is a very famous painting by Géricault. It's called The Raft of Medusa, and it was done in 1818 to 1819. It is a very large painting. It's about 4 foot by 6 foot high, and it is a painting that is in the Louvre in Paris. So we see a couple artistic innovations that Géricault's famous for. And the first one is this major X composition that's created in the painting. So if you look at the flag and you follow it down to the lower right hand corner where the man is dead and laying stretched out, your eye kind of follows his body and goes out the lower right hand corner of the canvas. Then if you look in the opposite corner, in the lower left hand corner of the canvas, you see the same thing. A stretched out body with feet that touch the edge of the canvas almost. And then your eye follows up to the red flag that the slave is holding to flag down a ship off in the distance. So Géricault actually went to the morgue to do studies for this particular painting. He went to study chopped up bodies that had been autopsied, so that when he painted them, they looked very realistic. The waters are infested with shark, and he wanted to portray that the water was dangerous. You can see the water looks rough and choppy, and there's a lot of movement and motion within the waves. So the story behind this painting is that there was a ship that was sailing for either Brazil or for the New World. And as the ship was sailing, the ship began to sink or something of that nature. And so bodies were then thrown overboard. And the captain is trying to decide who he saves and who is going to go on this little raft. The captain decides to save the crew and puts them in lifeboats and goes off to a different, to save their skins. The people in the painting who are still alive are waving at a ship passing by, trying to track them down to come save them. They are floating on the wreckage of the ship that was sinking. And you can see that these people have been here for days and days. When you're out to sea and it is very salty in the sea and you have no water, dehydration is a problem. And so they've done everything that they can to try to stay hydrated. They've stripped bodies of clothing and created sails out of them to make the raft more sustainable. You can see that some of the bodies are very dramatically placed in the canvas, stretching out to you. And Gericault really just punches up the drama here with the angles, but also with the expressions of the people on the raft. You can see that they have hopeless expressions. There's a man in the center who is, he looks like he's almost dead. His mouth is gaping open and his head is turned towards the sky. You can see that there's a small group of slaves who are still alive and are trying to flag down a ship that's passing by. The shipwreck happened off of the coast of Africa, and there are just a few survivors. You can see most everybody was left for dead, and that is because they were the lower class people of the ship. They were servants of the ship or the slaves themselves. So the story goes that it was typical when a slave ship were going to sail to the New World, that there was insurance on the slaves as well as the crew. And if the entire ship were to get sick and the captain were to have to abandon the ship, there was insurance money that could be collected for the lives of the people of the servant crew as well as the slaves, because they were considered property. They were not considered people. And so because of that situation, a lot of times captains abandon groups of people. They threw slaves overboard. Or if something went wrong within the ship, like this one, where the ship was beginning to sink, then the captain would hop in a raft or a lifeboat, save his own skin, row back to shore, and collect the insurance money. And that is surely what has happened here. I challenge you to look closely at this painting and really take in the horrors of the bodies that Gericault has painted for our contemplation. Knowing that he went to the morgue to study the chopped up bodies is an interesting frame of reference for you to gain understanding about how he artistically portrays people so that they can be as dramatic as possible. So I just want to include this work of art by Gericault. It's a study of hands and feet. Remember I told you that he went to the morgue to study body pieces and parts before he before he painted the raft of the Medusa. And so this is one of those studies that he did while he was observing at the morgue. This painting, called Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, painted in 1830, was painted shortly after Gericault paints the raft of the Medusa, about 10 years later. Delacroix was friends with Gericault and was highly influenced by his designs. You can see the X composition that we saw in the Gericault piece following through here to Delacroix's piece. Delacroix painted this particular piece to commemorate the revolution that had brought Louis Philippe to the French throne. This is a huge canvas. It's an allegory. The lady in the center is the personification of liberty. And you can see she's holding the French flag. So it's basically stating that liberty won and that she's taking over for France. The revolution put King Charles out of the limelight, or that's who Louis Philippe took over for and on the French throne. And this is probably the most popular of all of Delacroix's paintings. I told you it was very large. It was a huge hit in the salon and had tons of grandeur to it. You can see how romantic it is. Obviously, there's Abraham Lincoln in the middle. He's got a gun, or a figure that looks like Abraham Lincoln, um, in the fashion of what we would think of Lincoln as. He's got a gun, and he obviously is on the victor's side. You can see the people who have been defeated. They're laying in the streets, but it's not a bloody scene. It's romanticized. In all likelihood, how this event probably happened, it was probably really bloody and really gory. It was a revolution. You can see that the people who have fought bravely. The young boy, he's got shoes on and he's laying down, having been defeated. And then, of course, the young gentleman with the two guns in his hand walking towards the viewer with his side pack. So now we're going to go to England and talk about English landscape painting. John Constable painted the Hay Wain in 1821. And basically, there's a group of people in England who feel that the Industrial Revolution is not a good thing. And this would be John Constable's viewpoint. He's romanticizing the English landscape. It's picture perfect, and there's not a touch of the Revolution or the Industrial Revolution in the painting. You can see that it's beautiful in its waters. It has gorgeous, lush trees and vegetation. You can see the wagon cart is being pulled by the team of oxen, and it's just very picturesque. In all actuality, those people work really hard. It's a hot, sweaty job, and it's not pretty. Does it create picturesque land? Yes, but the idea is that there is no sense of the revolution here in any way, shape, or form, and this is John Constable's, it's his protest against the Industrial Revolution needing to be in England in the first place. Factory development and the urban centers grew primarily in the cities first and touched the countryside in a less severe way. And so he's trying to say, hey, let's preserve what we have. Let's not let the Industrial Revolution take over. So this is Turner's The Slave Ship. And as you read in the earlier slide, Turner is an abolitionist. He feels that slavery is wrong. And he sells this particular painting to an abolitionist group, and it becomes the face of the group's campaign. If you blow up the image, or you look at the image in your book so that you can get a closer perspective of the image, there's a really interesting story behind the painting. So here's what's happened. There's a ship here, and it's sinking, like many slave ships did. The ships that were carrying the slaves sometimes were too heavy because there were too much cargo in them. There were lots of reasons why they sank, but the journey from Europe to America was lengthy, and I think something like 75% of the ships that ventured out with slave cargo ended up sinking. At any rate, like a typical situation happened, the slaves were tossed overboard because the ship was sinking in order for the crew to collect the insurance money for the crew. You can see, if you look really closely, the bodies that are floating at the front of the canvas. They are in shark-infested waters, and so the sharks are eating the people that have been tossed over. And you know that they are slaves because Turner paints shackles floating at the top of the water. This is romanticism at its height. Like I said before, Turner has kind of a loose screw, and he wants to be able to capture the feeling of the sublime, and he wants to be able to paint it. And so it's a kind of uh, interesting perspective to be able to paint something that is a physical feeling. So, like, to be able to paint hot or to be able to paint cold, to be able to paint what it feels like to be strapped to the prow of a ship in a hurricane is a very interesting way or solution to figure out how to translate that into paint. The sky is somewhat symbolic because you see the light shining through. That's the symbol of the slaves going to heaven. And you can see the blood orange used. That's symbolizing the tragedy that's happened. The other thing is that this is very romanticized because if you think about it, slave shackles were made of steel. Steel does not float, but Turner paints them floating on the top of the water so that you can recount how many lives had been lost by the tossing overboard of the cargo. Turner uses a beautiful combination of blue, orange, and yellow in this painting. And it kind of has this interesting dissipation into the background. So Turner also believes highly in the sublime. The sublime is the idea that there are forces greater than oneself in the world, and that there's no way to control the sublime, only to experience it. So I encourage you to take a much closer look at this painting called The Slave Ship. It's one of the most important paintings that was done in the abolitionist commentary. So, Thomas Cole and Frederick Church were part of a group of people called the Hudson River School. It was named the Hudson River School because its members drew their subject matter primarily from uncultivated regions of New York's Hudson River Valley. Many of the painters, though, depict scenes from across the country, including the American Southwest, and they not only represent romantic panoramic landscape views, but they participated in an ongoing exploration of the individual versus the country's relationship with the development of the land. Meaning they look at the effects of the Industrial Revolution, they look at the effects of hand working the land versus machinery working the land. They also use the landscape genre as an allegorical vehicle to address the moral and spiritual concerns that go on in their daily lives. Frederick Church belonged to the Hudson River School. But his interest in landscape scenes didn't stick primarily to the United States. He traveled a lot. He went to South America, Mexico, Europe, the Middle East, Newfoundland, and yep, just those places. This painting, Twilight in the Wilderness, dates to 1860s, when the Civil War was really tearing apart the United States. The painting doesn't display evidence of turbulence or the discord going on in the U.S. It doesn't include any people at all. It constructs an idealistic viewpoint, a viewpoint that's comforting, that's a sense of solace. Um, Church is commenting on the conflict by not addressing the conflict, by reminding the viewer of how beautiful the land is all by itself. He's bringing to light the fact that the United States is displacing its Native Americans. Um, and he's discussing the fact that the Civil War is taking place, all without actually putting any people in the image at all. He wants to claim that there's a sense of divinity and providence to the land, one that has been hard to claim because of all the conflict that's going on in land ownership and in settling the land that has not been settled yet.